It was the morning of 5 June 1944. The air above northern France trembled not with the quiet hum of patrols, but with the relentless roar of engines. In every direction the sky seemed alive. American B 17 seconds, and B 24 seconds traced high-altitude paths across the horizon, their silver bellies flashing in the dawn. Below them clouds of dark smoke rose from bombed marshalling yards and rail lines that only days before had carried supplies to German coastal defences. For German soldiers stationed near the Normandy coast, the noise was constant. The air trembled like thunder that never ended. They didn't yet know that the invasion fleet was assembling across the channel, but they knew. Something immense was coming. And in that endless roar, many began to feel the creeping realization that their world was about to be swallowed whole. One German artilleryman later described it as a sky that no longer belonged to us. Early years of the war, German troops had watched their own Luftwaffe dominate the skies from Poland to France. But by the summer of 1944, everything had reversed. Now, it was the Americans and their endless fleets of bombers and fighters who ruled from above. Every railway station, every bridge, every convoy could be struck without warning. Resistance on the ground still existed, but it was resistance under siege. And when German POWs were finally captured, forced to sit in the fields of France or Belgium and look upward at the sky, filled with American aircraft, they understood the war was no longer a contest of armies. It was a storm from above. Because when the sky itself turns against you, resistance becomes hopeless. In the spring of 1944, the German Wehrmacht was still vast, but the balance of power had quietly shifted. What had once been an army supported by an aggressive Luftwaffe was now a ground force fighting beneath an empty sky. By this time, only a fraction of Luftwaffe's fighter wings remained in the West. Fuel shortages, attrition, and the relentless Allied bombing of airfields had thinned the ranks. The once fearsome Messerschmitts that had dominated Europe were now ghosts scattered, and few German infantrymen looked up and saw not the familiar black crosses of their own air, cover but contrails of Allied planes that stretched from horizon to horizon. On the ground, commanders tried to maintain confidence. Orders circulated, reminding troops that the Reich was still strong, that the air situation was temporary. But soldiers weren't fools. Every day they heard the thunder of bombers heading toward the Ruhr, Hamburg, or Berlin. At night they saw the glow of fires hundreds of kilometers away, the reflection of cities burning under. American and British bombs, German field reports from occupied France, reveal a chilling tone by mid-1944. Enemy air superiority prevents any movement by day. Trucks waited until nightfall to move ammunition. Medical convoys camouflaged their roofs with tree branches. Even messenger motorcycles, once the nervous system of German command, became rare in daylight. To the young conscripts stationed near Caen, the skies themselves seemed cursed. Allied reconnaissance planes, fast, silent, unseen, photographed their every trench. Every day they felt watched. Every night they prayed for clouds, because clear skies meant bombers. The Luftwaffe's officers knew it too. General Adolf Galland, one of Germany's top aces, later admitted that by the spring of 1944 the Allies owned the air. And when that happens, he said, you lose not just battles, you lose belief. For the first time, German soldiers felt like targets instead of hunters. They were fighting a war where the enemy no longer had. To find them, the enemy could simply look down, and soon the soldiers on the ground would discover what that really meant. By early June 1944, the sky over France had become a kind of prison. German units couldn't move without being seen, and they couldn't be seen without being struck. Columns that once rolled confidently across Europe now crawled like shadows. Drivers timed every move with the passing clouds. Whenever the sunlight broke through, they halted engines, idling men ducking beneath hedgerows, because somewhere above invisible, until it was too late, were the American P-47 Thunderbolts and British Typhoons planes built for one purpose: to hunt. To Allied pilots, these were targets of opportunity. To German soldiers, they were death without warning. The fighter bombers didn't care if a column was advancing, retreating, or simply lost. Anything that moved on a road by day was fair game. One German driver recalled, We drove until one of us shouted, "Aircraft!" and we ran for the ditches. They never missed. At first, the Luftwaffe tried to resist, but the few remaining fighters were overwhelmed before they could even reach their targets. Allied escort fighters flew in such numbers that any German attempt to rise into the sky was like throwing pebbles against a tidal wave. The Germans called it Jabo Fieber Fighter, Bomber Favera, paralyzing terror that spread across every frontline unit. In military briefings, commanders stopped using the phrase air cover. There was none. Even the most hardened veterans admitted that the constant presence of Allied aircraft drained their morale faster than any artillery barrage. Rail lines were shredded, bridges lay in ruins, supply depots were flattened before breakfast. For the Wehrmacht, this meant starvation not of food but of mobility. Tanks had fuel but couldn't risk moving. Infantry divisions had orders but no way to get there. American reconnaissance squadrons flew low, sometimes so low that German soldiers could see the pilot's goggles glinting in the sun. There was no escaping the eyes above. Every movement, every truck, every gun marked, photographed, bombed. One German sergeant captured near Saint-Lô later told his interrogators, "We were not beaten by men. We were beaten by the sky." And that sky was only growing darker. As the Allied armies pushed inland after 6 June 1944, German resistance was fierce, but it was also blind. Their commanders no longer saw the full battlefield, not because of confusion, but because Allied air power had erased their vision. Every attempt to send reinforcements toward the front ended in flames. Columns leaving the forests near Falaise or Villers-Bocage were annihilated before they even reached the fight. The Luftwaffe could barely get off the ground. Its few remaining pilots were outnumbered 10-1 and often forced into desperate defensive spirals over their own lines. From the ground, the spectacle was terrifying. German infantrymen watched as their own armoured support was cut to. Ribbons from above 47 seconds, swooping down rockets, shrieking the sky, flashing with explosions. The smell of burning fuel and the metallic stench of hot steel clung to the air for days. Captured diaries tell of men who had once laughed at the fact. Clumsy American tanks now writing that their only real fear was the planes that never leave the sky. Another soldier in the 352nd Infantry Division scrawled a final note before his capture. "The earth is ours, but the heavens are theirs, and they kill us with it." Allied air supremacy didn't just destroy equipment, it shattered coordination. Radio trucks were bombed, field headquarters vanished in firestorms, even courier runners, the backbone of German communication, were too afraid to cross open ground in daylight. Officers tried to restore order, shouting, "Hold the line!" But lines don't matter when the enemy can see everything. The Allies could strike anywhere and did. The psychological toll became impossible to hide. German soldiers began surrendering in small groups, waving makeshift white flags from roadside ditches. Not because they lacked courage, but because courage meant nothing when a single shadow passing across the field could end them. By midsummer, intelligence reports from Allied interrogations began to reveal a stunning pattern. Most captured Germans didn't mention tanks or artillery or infantry tactics. They spoke instead about air power. One POW told his interrogator bluntly, "You have too many airplanes, you can do whatever you want." And in that single sentence, you can hear the quiet collapse of the German fighting spirit, not defeated by ground forces alone, but by the overwhelming realization that the sky itself was lost. By August 1944, the German army in France was no longer. Retreat-in-Geit was running. What had begun as a fighting withdrawal turned into chaos on every road leading east, and above every fleeing column, the roar of Allied aircraft followed like a curse. The Luftwaffe was gone. What few planes remained were grounded by fuel shortages or destroyed on their airfields. That left the retreating Wehrmacht naked beneath the sky, a perfect target for the American P-47 Thunderbolt the Jug. It wasn't sleek or elegant, but it was ruthless. Its pilots called it a flying tank, and with 8 machine guns and rocket pods strapped under its wings, It could tear open convoys like tin foil. One German driver later recalled that retreating under daylight was suicide. We waited for dusk, but even then the sky glowed red from fires. The road was full of burned trucks and dead horses. Sometimes you had to push wreckage aside with your boots. Nowhere was this horror clearer than in the Falaise pocket. Between 14 and 21 August, the remnants of the German 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army were trapped in a shrinking noose. Every attempt to escape was met by Allied aircraft swarming overhead, Typhoons, Mustangs, Lightnings, Thunderbolts each, diving, firing, climbing, diving again. For days, the valleys around Chambois and Trun were a living nightmare. Thousands of vehicles choked the roads. Horses panicked in their harnesses. Smoke rose in black pillars. Pilots described it as target practice. Soldiers below called it the end. When Canadian and Polish troops finally closed the pocket, they found a graveyard. Nearly 10,000 German soldiers lay dead, many killed not by small arms or artillery, but by air attack. The wreckage stretched for miles, trucks fused to the road tank, turrets blown off, men still sitting in half-melted vehicles. The stench was unbearable. Among the survivors taken prisoner, many were silent. They didn't curse, they didn't plead. They simply looked upward. A few even pointed as if to say, "That's who defeated us." Allied pilots circling above could see the truth. The Germans already knew there would be no recovery from this. The Wehrmacht could rebuild divisions, replace rifles, even summon new recruits from home. But no factory, no training, no speech could give them back the sky. And when you no longer own the sky, your army is no longer an army, it's prey. When the guns finally fell silent around Normandy and the fields filled with prisoners, a strange stillness settled over the French countryside. Tens of thousands of German soldiers, part of Hitler's proud divisions, sat in open pens under the same sky that had destroyed them. For many, it was their first time seeing Allied aircraft without fear. The P-51 Mustangs and B-17 formations still passed overhead, heading east toward Germany. Every few minutes, the ground would vibrate with the deep growl of engines. The prisoners would stop eating or talking, eyes lifting instinctively to the horizon. Old reflexes die hard. One American guard at a POW enclosure near Saint-Lô later wrote in his journal, "When the bombers passed, they all went quiet. You could see it on their faces. They were beaten before they ever got captured." Inside the camps, word spread quickly of the true scale of Allied power. Many Germans had believed the bombing of France and Germany was exaggerated, a propaganda trick, but now they saw the sky crowded daily with hundreds of planes flying east, none of them even needing to fly in tight formation anymore. The air was theirs. Captured Luftwaffe men were hit, hardest by the sight. They knew exactly what that kind of control meant. Some spent hours watching through the wire, counting formations and whispering aircraft types under their breath. "There," one said softly to another, "that's a B-24 group. They fly at that altitude because they no longer expect interception." The tone wasn't admiration, it was resignation. For the younger POWs, the shock was different. They had grown up on tales of blitzkrieg lightning, war unstoppable movement tanks surging across borders, with the Luftwaffe overhead. But now sitting in American custody, they understood that lightning had changed hands. Many of them had seen it firsthand in the days before capture. They had watched American fighter bombers strike surgical precision bridges, crossroads, even individual vehicles. They had seen the Allied air armada move with such confidence that it no longer needed to hide. And as they watched, a question formed among them. How do you fight a nation that owns the air, the factories, and the fuel? The older officers didn't answer. They didn't have to. The silence said enough. Some prisoners even admitted a strange sense of relief. No more running from shadows in the sky, no more trembling at every distant engine. For the first time in months they could sit still without waiting for rockets to fall. But the sound never truly stopped. The air still belonged to someone else. By the winter of 1944, the German army's collapse was no longer just visible, it was inevitable. Even when their generals planned bold counteroffensives, the sky refused to cooperate. The ground troops could still fight bravely, but every move they made was betrayed by daylight. The last great gamble came that December, in the Ardennes, the Battle of Delova. The bulged German armour thundered forward through snow and fog, briefly shielded by bad weather. For a few days the sky was theirs again, so it seemed American units were pushed back, surprised and scattered. But then on the 23rd of December the clouds broke, and with the clearing skies came the end P. 47 seconds, P 38 seconds, and P 51 seconds roared into the frozen air, like hunting hawks released from a cage. Convoys were shredded, fuel dumps exploded, and the white snow turned black with smoke. The Luftwaffe tried to rise once more in desperate counterattacks, but their planes were outnumbered, their pilots exhausted, their fuel nearly gone. Within days the offensive crumbled. Captured German officers later admitted what their men already knew. Without command of the air, even the strongest army can only delay defeat. By early 1945, German towns burned nightly. Rail yards lay in ruins. Bridges collapsed faster than engineers could repair them. The Luftwaffe, the pride of the Reichswehr, reduced to scattered squadrons, often flying obsolete trainers in suicide missions against bombers that didn't even notice. On the ground, soldiers still fought, still obeyed orders, but their eyes told the truth. Every time a bomber formation passed overhead, they flinched. Every time a contrail crossed the winter sky, they stopped and watched. There was no faith left in the idea of victory, only endurance. Field Marshal von Rundstedt summed it up bitterly after the war. We could still fight on land, but without the air it was hopeless. That hopelessness seeped into every trench, every bunker, every command post. Men who had once marched with swagger now whispered prayers for cloud cover. The bravest tank. Commanders refused to move until dusk. Even the SS, once the symbol of fanatical resolve, dug deeper instead of advancing. For the soldiers who had lived through it, there was no mystery left. They had seen what it meant to fight a nation that could rebuild, rearm, and fly endlessly. They had looked up from burning roads, shattered forests, and ruined towns, and realized that resistance, no matter how fierce, could never overcome the sky. The war had been lost long before Berlin fell, as was lost in the air. When the war finally ended in May 1945, millions of German soldiers returned. Homier never returned at all. Those who did carried more than wounds or memories. They carried the echo of engines in the sky. Even in peace, the sound of a distant aircraft could still make them look up. For them, the lesson of the war was carved into memory. Technology had changed the meaning of power. Courage and discipline could hold a line, but only until the air turned against you. No matter how strong your tanks, no matter how deep your bunkers, there was no defense against the sheer weight of steel and fuel that America could send through the clouds. In camp after camp, German POWs spoke of it with a strange mix of awe and despair. One captured officer told his interrogator in 1945, "We lost not when our tanks burned, but when your planes owned the sky. The air war had not just destroyed. City-sit had destroyed belief. The belief that the Reich could endure, that any army could resist such relentless reach. When a single bomb group could erase a division's supply line in minutes, the idea of control itself became obsolete, and that was the true realization for those who had witnessed it. The war wasn't simply lost on the ground, it was lost in the air, in that vast and merciless space where humanity first learned what total warfare really looked like. For the German POWs, who looked up from their camps and saw the endless streams of American planes heading east, there was no more illusion. The world had entered a new age, ruled not by the soldier in the trench, but by the pilot above him. And in that silence, after the engines faded, they understood the final truth of the war. You can fight men, you can fight machines, but you cannot fight the sky.